everyone can be seated. Second scariest question I'm going to ask today. Do the parties have anything to raise before the jurors come in? Ms. Kappelman.
No, sir.
Mr. Rauschbaum.
No, Your Honor.
Please bring in the jurors. Everyone can be seated. Members of the jury, I hope you had a restful break. We are going to resume with the state's case at this time. Please call your next witness.
State calls Stephen Webster.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth?
Yes, sir, I do.
You may take your seat.
Thank you, Judge.
Please introduce yourself and spell your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Webster, Stephen Webster.
How are you employed?
I'm an attorney
How long have you been a member of the Florida Bar?
since 2005.
Did you represent Dan Markel?
I did.
During what time period did you represent him?
I think it was May of 2014 and until he was murdered.
And during the time that you were, well, let me ask you, before his murder, when was the last time you had spoken with him?
I spoke to him that morning.
Right. And what was the main goal of your representation of Mr. Markel?
So I had just started my firm, and you know, like any small business, you're scared and you're hungry. And a friend of mine called me, Tor Friedman, and said, I have a client for you. And I was like, okay. And he said he's a law professor. And I was like, okay. And he said, it's a family law case. And I said, well, Tor, I don't do family law, and you know that. And he said, well, it doesn't matter. He's a law professor. He'll teach you everything you need to know. And I said, okay, well, that makes sense. So I agreed to meet with him. And the night before, I read all the papers, and they were voluminous. I printed them and actually read every word. And we'd already set up a meeting at Voodoo Coffee on Tennessee Street, and I really didn't think I was going to accept the case. I could just tell from the tenor of the papers that it was really, really contentious, and it just didn't feel like something I probably wanted to get involved in. But I wanted to meet him anyway. And so I met him, and I liked him. I liked him a lot. And so I decided I would take the case. I mean, it's not a prerequisite that I like you to represent you, but in something like that, I didn't want to get involved in a contempt type case with law professors, where ultimately it could end up being disrespectful to the court, and I didn't want to be involved in something like that if I really felt like it was going to be that kind of a relationship. But when I met him, I didn't feel like it was going to be that way, and so I agreed to take it. And his primary concerns were he wanted to get more time with his children, if at all possible, but he didn't want to change the kind of the time sharing. He had a kind of an unusual request. He wanted to see if there was any way that he could see the children every night when he didn't have them, to tuck them into bed and kiss them goodnight. And he said, look, I'll only stay 5 minutes. I promise I won't bother anybody, and I'll leave. And I said, Dan, that's probably never going to happen. That's just probably not reasonable. And then he was really concerned about parental alienation, which at the time I wasn't, really familiar with it. I didn't do family law, but I was familiar with it from the perspective of I learned about it in law school and stuff like that. But he was really concerned that the grandmother, Donna Adelson, was really trying to drive a wedge between him and the children. And he actually told me that he heard her refer to him as stupid on a Skype call. He couldn't see her in the Skype screen, but he heard her say something to the effect of "stupid's on the phone," and he was livid about it, and he was ready to basically kind of go to war over that.
Did that sort of reference the filing that we're familiar with, where Grandma says you're stupid, and he was seeking to have Grandma enjoined from having unsupervised contact with the kids?
Yeah, and I didn't have the opportunity to actually talk to him about that yet because he was killed. But it was my understanding that after that filing, he heard her. Actually, he heard her, because that's what he told me. He said, I heard her call me stupid. But she wasn't in the screen, but he knew her voice. And so he was very upset about that. And then the other thing that he was upset about, he wanted the Holocaust diamond back.
So
That
property of his, family property that Wendi had.
Yeah, and
Okay.
he wanted that back.
All right, so what about money? Was he worried about money?
No.
Any chance that the case could have been resolved through $1 million payoff to Dan Markel from the Adelsons?
In exchange for what?
A relocation?
No.
We've heard some testimony that everything was going well between Dan Markel and Wendi in the few weeks leading up to his death. Do you have any knowledge of that fact?
It's untrue. There's a reason he hired me. He didn't retain me because he needed a friend. Tor basically told me on the phone call, he said, look, there's going to be a trial, and it's going to be acrimonious, and he needs a lawyer that can go into the courtroom and be prepared to fight. He said, that's why I think you could handle this case. And that was, we were heading towards a trial. And he certainly, he sent me an email the day before talking about how he was irate because Wendi, unbeknownst to him, had actually enrolled or applied to have been enrolled at the School of Arts and Sciences. And she didn't even talk to Dan about it. So he found out the day before when he got called from the school saying that Ben had been accepted. And so he emailed me and said, I'm irate about this. He said, I don't think it's appropriate.
Okay.
So, no.
So there were a bunch of issues still going on.
Yes.
It was hot at the time.
Yes.
All right. And there was some suggestion that Dan Markel was expected to lose all the filings that were currently pending at the time of his death, and Wendi was expected to prevail on everything. Do you agree with that assessment?
You mean like with the contempt and all of that?
Yeah.
No, I would not have got involved if I thought he was going to lose on the contempt. My reputation travels with my clients too if they're doing things like that, right? If you're representing a client who is disrespecting the court, it's hard not to feel like that's bleeding off on you and you're disrespecting the court. And in Tallahassee, Florida, if you practice in this circuit, if I disrespect Judge Everett today, every judge in this circuit that matters to me is going to know about it before lunch tomorrow. And it's just, no. So, no, I would not have accepted. That's why I didn't think I was going to take the case when I read all that.
And seeking contempt is kind of a big deal amongst lawyers, right?
Yes. Contempt is, it's an ugly, it's a very ugly kind of prospect. And as a lawyer, that was one of my main concerns is, she was a lawyer. And I did feel like she should be held in contempt. She didn't disclose things on her financial affidavit, and Dan convinced me of that.
But that was to be determined, right?
But
By a court.
Yes, but in my mind,
Yes.
that was the only reason I took it.
Okay.
And, at the end of the day, you can lose your law license for that. I guess you would have to report that to the bar. I didn't research it, but the court would refer it to the bar. If the court found you were in contempt, the court would refer it to the bar, and you could lose your law license. So yeah, it's pretty serious, in that regard.
We heard, I think, from both sides in opening that Mr. Markel was brilliant, but I'm not sure anyone that actually knows about that has told us. Do you have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, it was why I decided to take the case. I liked him. He was actually funny. He had good humor about it. Even kind of as acrimonious as all of this was, the big picture stuff he didn't have any anger. He was angry about the calling him stupid. That made him angry. But I think in his mind, eventually a lot of this stuff would resolve and should resolve. He wasn't vindictive, or vengeful, and that was a big part of the reason why I was willing to get involved. I felt like he was kind of looking at it like a business deal still, with the exception of the stupid comment. So he was funny, and obviously smarter than I am, that's for sure. So,
What are a lawyer's ethical obligations to a client in terms of the client knowing what is in the filings that are being filed on their behalf?
well, I think that depends.
Objection, Your Honor. It's not an expert.
We'll continue examining the witness.
all attorneys in Florida governed by the rules of professional conduct?
Yes, ma'am.
And are you, as a 20-year lawyer, familiar with those rules?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so what are those rules in reference to, can a lawyer put things in a filing that the client doesn't know about or not?
You have a duty to keep your client informed. That is an actual affirmative duty on every lawyer.
That you have to be in contact with your client, keep them informed of important events that are going on in the case. There are certain decisions that only the client can make, like whether to testify, things like that. But there are certain decisions that a lawyer can kind of make, procedural decisions on filing certain things. But you have a duty to keep your client informed of important events.
If Dan Markel was planning to move or seeking to relocate himself at the time of his murder, would you have known about that?
Yes.
And was he planning to do that or trying to do that?
Absolutely not.
One moment, please, Your Honor.
Take your time.
Further questions?
Cross-examination. Very brief.
Good afternoon, Mr. Webster.
Good afternoon.
You started representing Professor Markel in, I think you said May 2014, around that time frame?
Yes, sir, I believe so.
By the way, at that point in time, what did you specialize in? Were you a divorce lawyer?
No.
Had you ever done a divorce case?
I mean, I had done some, like I worked for other firms, and but for the most part, if I was going to take it, me personally, it would have to be no kids involved, and one of those situations where the assets were already agreed upon how they were going to be split up. I didn't want to get involved in fighting in cases where kids were going to get hurt. It's not how I wanted to use my law license.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for talking over you. What did you specialize in?
I mean, as an attorney, I don't think I'm allowed to say I specialize in anything unless I'm board certified. So I'm not board certified in anything.
What did you? What type of work did you do more of?
At that point in my career, I'd primarily done a lot of criminal defense work.
Okay. So you were a criminal defense lawyer who was going to do a divorce case.
Yeah, I guess that's fair to say.
Were you aware that Professor Markel's previous lawyer had quit?
I saw in the filings that lawyers had withdrawn, and yeah.
And you never went to court with Professor Markel, right?
No, he got killed before I had my chance.
You're aware that the court admonished Professor Markel in court earlier in the year, right?
I don't know if I was familiar with that. I read the papers. If it was in the papers, I mean, look, it appeared to me that it was very acrimonious, and there were lengthy pleadings and filings, and it was one of the things I talked to Dan about. I said, you need a lawyer. You need to stop drafting voluminous pleadings, and we need to just get this on the rails and focus on what matters.
Okay. Ms. Kappelman asked you about court filings and the ethics of lawyers. You recall her asking you that?
Yes, sir.
Sometimes you file things. You have to keep your clients informed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes you file things, and you're able to file things that you don't have to go over every word with your client, right?
Yeah, that's fair.
No further questions.
Redirect examination.
No questions, Your Honor.
Mr. Webster, you missed that.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You could be released, Your Honor.
Have a good day.
Thanks, sir.
Please approach.